Welcome, everybody. It is my great pleasure to introduce Nichole Garcia. Nichole joined us this year as Assistant Professor of Higher Education. She came to us from UCLA. And as with many things, we realize when we kind of put people in boxes, it gets a little complicated. And so she's going to talk about some of the work she's doing in terms of access and experiences in higher education for Latinx students. So we're real excited to have her.
Thanks, Joe. How's everyone doing? Good. We're going to get live in here. So how many grad students do I have in here? How do I know? Okay. Well, I'm going to present to you then and the audience and talk about how I came to this work, how you collaborate with people that may be more senior in your field, and what kind of methodology you put forth and discussions around that. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to stop me and ask me. Again, this study in particular is really bridging K-12 and higher ed, which isn't necessarily done all the time. We can talk about implications in K-12, which could have implications for higher ed and vice versa, but never really bridging the two. So that's really what this work is doing, and I'll get more into that. So this is a collaborative effort with the K-12 scholar, Dr. Irizarry at the University of Connecticut. He is well known in K-12 context in regards to Puerto Rican studies and so forth, and I'll talk a little bit more how this collaboration happened. But the title of this is El Esconder, Hide and Seek, Reconstructing College Choice for Puerto Rican Students in Urban Schools. So how did I come to this work? I have a question for you all. When we think about Puerto Ricans coming to the US, where do we think that they go in terms of demographics, in terms of states that they end up? Starting from, let's say, the 1940s, 1960s, 1970s.
New York.
Northeast. New York, okay. Anything else? No? Why do we think that?
Populations that currently exist in that area are higher density.
Okay, higher density.
West Side Story.
West Side. Yes and no. Right? I mean, in Hollywood, we think about that, right? These are common conceptions, sometimes stereotypes that get played out into everyday life. But yes, for the most part, we do think that Puerto Ricans do come to the Northeast, in particular, New York, Jersey, and so forth. However, I came to this work because my grandparents are Puerto Rican on my mom's side, and they actually migrated to Utah in the 50s, which wasn't somewhere you go. So I ended up growing up in Utah, and it was a very interesting experience, and I'll talk more about this. So my grandparents are from Caguas on the island, and they directly went to Salt Lake City, Utah, because my grandfather got at work in the coal mines there. So there was like 10 families. They did a pit stop in New York, Harlem, and then ended up going to Utah because that's where the work was. So when you think about schooling experiences, and you have a teacher that's never seen a Puerto Rican before, what happens to this specific student, right? So these are my grandparents, and that's my mom. And so I think she's about maybe 4 there in Caguas in front of my grandparents' house. So I heard a lot about my mother's experiences in Utah growing up, being racialized, being definitely stereotyped, being, I guess, trapped into specific tracks in terms of education, not getting the opportunity that she was smart or intelligent. She definitely was racialized as Black in her schooling experiences. So hearing a lot of really racial slurs every day build up. So that has resulted in my mother being very insecure, but also instilling in me a sense of confidence and knowing that I can do this work and how do I do it right. So that's really what informs me, or what Dolores Salgado Bernal calls cultural intuition, right? Chicana feminist epistemology, way of knowing and coming to the work that allows you varying sensitivities to how you approach your research. So that's a little bit about my background. If you have any questions regarding that, this is why I'm concerned about where Puerto Ricans end up, how do they end up in the educational system, and where are they attending schools. Any questions? Okay. Okay, so a little bit about, and thank goodness this is on the East Coast, because every time I get this talk on the West Coast, they're like, wait, what? What are you talking about? Even to the point where I was getting ready to do my dissertation, and my advisor was like, I don't know if we need to study Puerto Rican. I was like, oh, we do, and this is why. So this is really important, and they sound basic in terms of K-12 context, but in higher ed, this is fairly new. We're pushing the field in different ways. So one way, the statement of the problem is, obviously Latino students, Latinx students have been treated as one homogeneous group. Especially quantitatively, when we look at them through numbers, we say, oh, Latinos, blah, blah, blah. But what does that look like when we take those numbers and pull them apart and really account for variation? Not just among groups, but also within groups, right? So Puerto Ricans have a very distinct experience, depending if you're on the island, if you grew up here, if your circular migration is happening, and especially now post Hurricane Maria, is looking very different than it did before. So I ran across some reading, and this is also how I came to this word in K-12 context, really challenging deficit perspectives. Does anyone know what deficit perspectives means when I say that? Anyone want to tell me what I mean? I know my students are in here, so.
Kids of color are lower than white kids.
Okay, that's a good deficit perspective. What else?
Viewing the differences between populations as the result of something that minority populations lack rather than systemic issues.
Great definition, right? So in K-12 context, I was really concerned about, okay, how are these populations being talked about and what's an asset-based approach? And again, higher ed is also doing this work. Sean Harper is really influential in pushing this work forward. But in K-12, well, actually, I was reading in higher ed, I was like, where are the Puerto Ricans at? Like, question mark. Because we talk a lot about Mexican Americans and Chicanos, which is important because they are the largest ethnic minority group. However, when we talk about the second largest, it's Puerto Ricans. So K-12 scholars, Jason Irizarry and Rosalia Roland-Dow are really pushing this field in K-12. And what they're calling DiaspoRicans, or those are the Puerto Ricans that live off the island in the US in different contexts, and not just in the tri-state area. They're all over the US. So they're really examining that, and they conceptualize different ways of understanding what these students are experiencing. So what I did in terms of grad students in the room, I was like, oh my gosh, this stuff is amazing. So I reached out to Jason, and I had some of my data and some of my writing, and I sent it to him, and I was like, I'm really interested in talking to you about how you're pushing the boundaries in K-12. And he was like, absolutely, let's talk. And that's kind of how this was birthed. And he also has an understanding conceptual framework called RicanStructed, where he's really talking about asset-based approaches in K-12 context. So I was like, I really love this work. Can we work together? And he said yes. So fortunately, that's working out. So when we think about, like I said, in particular, Mexican Americans and, well, yeah, Mexican Americans, Chicanos are the highest ethnic minority in the US, right? Alongside Puerto Ricans as the second. In terms of our enrollment and attainment, we are attaining at the lowest amounts across the educational pipeline. So I would argue that Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, we stall behind, even though ethnically we are the majority. That's a really big crisis, and it isn't really changing. Many people assume that the longer you are in the US, the more likely you are to go to college, but we're finding that to not be true. So one point I would say in higher ed, it's really big right now, has been this kind of foundational in higher ed, is college choice model. How do people decide where to go to college, and why do they make that decision? So unpacking college choice for DiaspoRican students in particular. So college choice, anyone know, besides Dr. Hernandez, Dr. Lund, about college choice model, what they say? I'm done, right? So in higher ed in particular, Hostler and Gallagher are the first to put this forward. What they're talking about is a three-stage model. We can complicate models all day too. And what they say is predisposition, searching, and choice are the three elements that students engage in order to choose where they go to college. Predisposition really accounts for like parent level of education, SES, so the characteristics background of the specific population. Predisposition refers to how they're getting college information and what is it saying and how they're receiving it. And then choice is where they actually choose to go. Now, what they forgot to do was take into account that not all students have equal So choice versus access. So we have Amy Ferguson comes out with a critique around these college choice models and saying we really have to problematize how racial and ethnic groups understand college choice, because it's not as simple as, yes, you're going to go to college. You're going to get in, and this is how you're going to get in because your parents went. And we know that this is not necessarily true for Puerto Ricans in the US. So more recently, and I mean recently, 2017, like this is just happening, we are starting to see an evolution of Latinx students and college choice processes and more models coming to the forefront regarding their experiences. I would say they're not so much specific to the ethnic variation. Most of them are on Mexican Americans. And more recently, Nancy Occiado Gill put forth a Latinx framework to understand how this looks different for Latinx students in particular, using what she used, the Chicana feminist epistemology, and Gloria onto this concept of conocimiento, which is the type of consciousness that you have within every phase of the model. So this is where our intervention comes in. So in order to do this, we implement two frameworks, LatCrit, which comes from legal studies. It's a concept in which Latinos are the center of knowledge holders and how we understand who we are in the context of education and in legal studies. So we're more concerned with immigration status, identity, language, and so forth. The diaspora framework is something that Jason Irizarry, my co-author, has conceptualized with his other colleague, Rosalia Roland Dow. And what they're saying is that we cannot divorce the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico, and that we really have to take into account what this does and the impact on migration across the United States, and not just in the transnational sense, but also in the local sense. So what does it look like in New York, New Jersey? Because in K-12 schools, it changes, right? Higher ed is the same. Every state has a different way of access, so what does it look like? With this combination, we are saying that we're reconstructing discourse regarding students and how they come and understand higher ed and K-12. So our method. This was really unique. Jason approached me and he said, well, I have this data, you have this data, so why don't we combine our data sets? And I was like, what? That's crazy. Why would we ever do that? They're not similar. And he's like, yes, they're very much similar. And that's where the heart of it comes from, because you get this multi-generational socio-historical understanding of data. It's really interesting. So I said, absolutely, let's do it. So we have two data sets emerging from distinct but interrelated studies of DiaspoRican and college choice processes. So again, we looked at these individuals in school context and really understanding K-12 and higher ed. So Irizarry and Ruiz, they did a year-long ethnographic study of 6 DiaspoRican female high school students in the Northeast. And I would say this Northeast state is not necessarily where you assume a lot of Puerto Ricans are. So it really gave way to understanding how these students were experiencing their schools. My study, I had 8 diasporic participants, educational oral histories, multi-generation college completion. What do I mean by that? I had parent-child dyads, meaning I had 4 dyads, and the college child and the college parent. They had already went to college and received a degree from the US. So they had already experienced the educational system, K-12 and higher ed, both parent and child. So that's giving 3 layers of understanding of how we understand college and college choice processes. So the methods, so college choice processes, that was our thing in common that we had. And we created distinct case studies regarding that in particular. So how are they understanding it in K-12 context? How are they understanding it based in their community? What were their parents telling them? And so forth. So then we consolidated all of our notes along with my methodology. I kept a journal throughout. It's basically documenting everything that I was understanding. He did ethnographic field notes. We had interview data from students, parents, and teachers. Then we analyzed the data within and across case studies, and then open coding, line by line analysis, focus coding, and themes. This really was interesting because we would kind of argue of like, no, this is not what it is. And this is what it is. But because we had different lenses, K-12 scholar, a higher ed scholar, he was a first-gen student, I wasn't. And so we were kind of conflicted, but we knew that was a strength, and we knew that we could talk about it in this paper in particular. So what did we find? Most people would be like, this is nothing new. Findings, K-12 schools, parents, and community. So what do we mean? We talk about the problematic ways that these students are being racialized within the K-12 context. Then we look at the assets that their parents shared with them in order for them to be successful and started thinking about college choice processes. And then one element is how the community talks about college, right? Because it's really left out in college choice models in terms of higher ed literature. So K-12 schools. This is a student, again, she's a current student in high school. Her name's Yvonne. She shared the following in one of the interviews. When I told my teacher that I wanted to be recommended for the AP class because I wanted to go to college, she said to me that she wasn't going to recommend me because she didn't want me to fail. She told me to wait until my senior year, but I had heard that junior year was the most important, and that is why I wanted to be recommended. I had straight A's the whole year. So what do we hear in this narrative? This is happening like current day.
The assumption that the student was going to fail, even though she was doing well in school, that the teacher was trying to protect her. But like, still holding her back.
Right. So we have a gatekeeper, right? We call him a gatekeeper in our article because gatekeeping, access is being stunted, and this is happening today still. So very interesting to find. Then we went to my data, and we found this. So Rocio, I can speak a little bit more about my data because I know them intimately in different ways. He, at this point, high school teacher in New York, definitely passionate. His mom also was a college teacher in New York. So we had multiple generations of understanding within college context. K-12 and then college. So Rocio reflecting on his interactions with his high school student college advisor. And he went to high school in like the 90s. So this is what he said. He certainly was not pushing me to do anything important. He was not pushing me to go to an Ivy League. He pushed other kids to go, and they were going to the Ivy League schools or really great schools. I remember this vividly. When we were making our college list, we had reached average and safety schools. I had one meeting with the college advisor, and he just told me to put State University of New York as my reach school, which is not a bad place, but it's not like, yes, you can go here or there. So again, a similar narrative, right? We're hearing this narrative of rejection, not access. But the unique thing about this and why it adds to the complexity of our understanding of college choice models is that in college, in higher ed literature, we assume that if your parent has a college degree, you're going to go on and get a degree and go higher than your parent. But we can see that in terms of where the student was going to get placed and where he was thinking about going to school, that this gatekeeper was saying, I don't think you should think about Ivy League, even though he was more than qualified to go. And his parent, you should have heard his mother go off. She was like, I never knew this. When I interviewed them together, he's like, oh, I thought I shared it with you. So there's some type of miscommunication, misinformation, and trust being in the K-12 schools that's happening that's really stunting where Puerto Ricans are ending up. In terms of parents, Marius referenced similar experiences and a desire among parents for their children to have opportunities that may have eluded them. So he's really reflecting on who he gets help from. And so he states, I don't have anyone in the school who has really helped me to plan for college. The only person who has believed in me and has made me want to go to college is my mother. This is common within K-12. We know that students have high aspirations, and they usually get those aspirations from their parents. And so it's just another confirmation in what we know in K-12 lit. So what happens when you have college-educated parents and you go through the process? When Maria was asked who helped her in her college choice process, she stated the following. I'm pretty sure my dad did research. My dad, he's an accountant, so everything is an Excel spreadsheet. I think he thought, okay, what are the classes you need to get into college? And he made sure that I took all those classes. For me, I'm like, oh, but I want to do this and I want to do that. He was like, but these are the classes we emphasized had to take. He was my counselor. So by the time she went to college and started understanding, it was really her dad that stepped in and was like, I can help you with this because you're not getting the help that you need. And so we can see that the multi-generation understanding of what happens when we think about college, who's helping us get there, and who's helping us succeed, really in the hands of the parents, right? So this whole deficit understanding of parents, Latino parents don't care is simply false. We see it in the evidence that that's so not true. And lastly, when we think about community and college choice models, what is the role that community comes and brings, and what do they have to offer? And again, aligning with our theoretical framework, community is central in how we understand who we are, how we get to where we're at. So Luz, who noted the following during a class discussion: my community, people think it's bad, like we are bad. So again, she already knows that I have a strong understanding of that deficit understanding of our community. But if you really know what's up, then you can see that we care about each other. We want each other to succeed. I feel that support. I didn't feel like I had anybody to talk to about college, and my mother saw I was stressed. She called a friend who went to college, and that's where I started talking. That's where it started to get real for me. So using networks in which we have, and then also engaging parents, right? Again, it goes back to parents and community engagement and networks and saying, I know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody. If you're a person of color, especially a Latina or Latino, you understand how that works. So it's like, let me get on the phone, I know somebody, let me help you. So as I said, my students had completed college, or my participants had completed college as well as their parents. But the children that were college completers were really interested in changing the game. And so Ramon, as a doc candidate in sociology, discusses his dissertation topic. He states, I'm doing my dissertation on the Puerto Rican student movement in New York City in the 1960s. Along with Black students, Puerto Rican students disaggregated the flagship CUNY at Brooklyn and City College, where over 0% of students were white. Where majority of students were white in 1968. The student movement forced open admissions and desegregation, which led to people like my mom having a better chance of getting admitted. It changed the city. Puerto Ricans played a major role in transforming it, and that story has not been told. So we can see that this lovely student whose mother went through the system in the 1960s is now studying what his mother experienced. And his mother was a radical activist, and he didn't find that out until I interviewed them. And he was like, what? So it was really cool to see what these parents and children learned about each other. But as you can see, I would say this is the strength that comes from studying K through 12 and higher ed context and coupling data, because you can see the evolution happen, right? So yes, the socio-historical damaging happens, but what are we doing about it as community leaders and thought partners? And this is one product that we're having, and he's almost done. So we look forward to this book coming out one day. So what does this all mean in the context? So like I said, in K through 12 and higher ed, it's really rare that we bridge data sets together, and it's really rare that we talk to one another. So Jason and I have really thought about reconstructing college choice as a conceptual way of understanding how we talk about college among Latinos, among Puerto Ricans in the US in different contexts. So we seek to disrupt problematic dominant narratives of Puerto Rican diasporic communities and replace them with more authentic counter narratives. As you can see, we try to do that with the data that we coupled together. We address the pervasive impact of the US Puerto Rican colonial relationship on Puerto Ricans on and off the island. So there are more Puerto Ricans in the US now, even pre-Hurricane Maria. There are more Puerto Ricans in the US. Now there's even more. The island is basically, we can just talk about that all day. So this is even a changed implication of what that looks like now. And everyone that went to Florida, like K through 12 schools, are going to have a hard time responding to this big, massive migration. And then locate these efforts within the broader socio-historical and social-political context in which they unfold. Again, the relationship with Puerto Rico and the US is ever evolving, so we'll see what happens. But this is just a little bit of the work that we're doing. And we got word last week that it's going to be published, so it will come out soon. I just finished the references before I came out here. So that is it. Are there any questions? Like really fast. Vanessa?
So you mentioned that like a lot of like what the data is about like college choice and that has changed post Hurricane Maria. Can you say a little bit more about
College choice?
or you mentioned something about how like the college like this whole process has been changed a lot because of Hurricane Maria. Do you have any like
Do I have information? So this is my next research project. Is looking at I know I'm so excited. With one of actually our PhD students that maybe later on today to talk about that. But where did displaced students go? On the island, the University of Puerto Rico has a very large contention with the student population, and it's happened since the inception of the University of Puerto Rico system, which kind of functions like a CUNY system there. And so in order for the island to be replenished, they automatically go to budget cuts, and it always hits the university first. And so students have been striking. You had the largest student strike on the island 2 years ago. So they were starting to leave because they weren't getting what they needed in terms of access. And so what that looks like now post-Hurricane Maria and what the U.S. government did with displacement programs across, so we had one at Cornell, we had one at NYU, and so forth. We don't really know if they stayed, if they returned. Some of the colleges advertised that this is a one-semester program, you'd return. Cornell did that in particular, some didn't. Rutgers is one of those spaces where that's very ambiguous, and we know for a fact that students came here and stayed here, which also is problematic for the island because all the resources that they need to replenish it in terms of the next generation is now here in the U.S. So no, I don't know. I can only have assumptions on what I read right now, but that's on the agenda. Interviews start this summer. For questions?
Talk a little bit more about what you saw in the dyad. So obviously what you presented here is like this story of this very supportive parent who's acting as a counselor. And sort of in what other, did you find that parents were usually taking on other roles like in replacement of what students were not getting in school, or was it kind of something else?
Yep, in K-12 context and higher ed in particular. And so that study, I did a comparative analysis of Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, and I purposely had the samples have obtained in the U.S. because I wanted to understand how they were experiencing colleges in the U.S. and how the parents understood their own college experience and how it formed their children's. And what I found was there was a huge disconnect because the parents went to college as non-traditional students, as parents themselves, first-gen students. So by the time their children got to the actual college process, they didn't feel like they had enough expert knowledge to help them navigate it. So it was kind of like this distancing, but also being like, yeah, you need to do this. So it was this weird contradiction that was taking place. So I have another article that is under review right now talking about what that looks like for Mexican Americans in particular. And then I have another one for Puerto Rican. So it was very two distinct processes. And how they vocalize and understand each other in the household really impacted how the student or the child would listen, which is parent styling 101 strategy. So there was all these conflicts and stuff. But yeah, they definitely had to step in a lot. And with Puerto Ricans in particular, I have this concept called sin pelos en la lengua, which means like without missing words. So Puerto Rican students' parents were in the school, like, you're not doing this to my child, like, get out of my face. And the children learned that from their parents. And so they were also like that in their education upbringing, like very straightforward. So hopefully that will come out soon. We can talk more about that. But yeah, it was very simple. Like,
Yeah, that was really interesting to me because it seemed like in that case, like we were talking about like Puerto Ricans, like the centers of knowledge, and like in that case you have the parents being positioned as, or maybe themselves, I don't know, as like experts now in the college process, but that process is kind of different. And
Absolutely.
So I don't know, like the extent to which you thought that.
tons of tensions, expert enough, expert not. There's a lot of contradictions. So that's just adding to what we know in college models. Yeah, it was a lot. And I had small myself. So
Yeah, I'm going to go in a very different direction. Just
okay.
since you use LaCrit as your theoretical grounding, can you talk a little bit about one, the theory itself?
Yeah.
And two, the ins and outs of using a theory that's rooted in law and then applied to the social sciences.
Oh, very question. Thank you for that. Like kind of a, yeah, so LACRIT. So most people, have you heard of critical race theory in education, right? It's like the sexy theory. So when we think about, and it's not the only theory, and I think Dr. Desai and I have like theoretical conversations all the time. I'm like, wait, what about this? What about that? So when we think about constructivism and positivism, right, we know that CRT is kind of on the constructivism side, it is in that area. So CRT came out of law, mostly Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell. You see this wave happen. Then we have William Tate, Lori Lansing-Billings, Danny Solorzano, bring it into educational context. So first, really in K through 12 context, and then it gets brought into higher ed. Higher ed scholars, I would say some of them, they're kind of like me, where they're bridging K through 12 and higher ed. So you have Solorzano, Delgado Bernal, and Yoso really bring Lat crit. So what they're saying is a critique on critical race theory, saying like, yes, race is important, but what about ethnicity? What about culture? What about immigration status? And how does that impact the legal system, right? Because how Latinos experience law is very different than how Black folks experience the legal system. And so that must be true and hold true for educational context too. So hopefully I answered that for you. But in terms of Lat crit, again, it really started in 1998 with Valdez's work in law, Margaret Montoya's work in law as well. So how we understand it in this study in particular is really looking at the legal aspect and how Puerto Rico is a colony of the US and that the laws are very ambiguous of being on the island and being here, who is a citizen, who's not, you do have citizenship status, but it's very problematic even though we have it because we're very much treated like second-class citizens and so forth. So that's how I understand. We can talk more about that. But.
Oh, thank you for mentioning about this, because I use his work when it comes to pure legal theory.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's just a nice, when you're doing research in an area that's under quote unquote study, it's a nice, the law is a nice explanatory framework.
Absolutely.
I think.
Yeah, because you can see, I think the strength of Lat crit and CRT is the material conditions of like racism and oppression and how it gets played out in the everyday law. And I was fortunate enough that I worked with some of these foundational people, so I was trained pretty good. I think hopefully they'd be proud, but yeah.
Can I ask sort of a follow-up question around that? You also mentioned you take Lat crit and use it with diasporic analyses or thinking about diasporic studies, and I think that from my understanding, that right, so diasporic theories is also rooted in ethnic studies and American studies, and sort of so thinking about transnationalism in that way, right? And then sort of an analysis of Lat crit, which I'm not as familiar with, but if it's rooted, I mean, those are also potentially competing analytic frameworks. Like, I'm curious to understand, and different understandings of race, right, and how racialization processes happen. So how do you kind of think together? And then relatedly, you talk about sort of, and towards the end also sort of like how you think with and about coloniality. So I'm also kind of curious how that plays out in your analysis.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so, and I think we've discussed this in regards to, I would argue that, and Dr. Hernandez, please correct me if I'm wrong, and you too, that higher ed is kind of lagging in terms of our theoretical understanding. So this whole like crit CRT is very sexy right now. And so this bringing this K through 12 understanding, as Jason and Rosalia, how does it work together, right? So again, they're saying here that there's just a need to have a framework specific to Puerto Ricans in the US. And that transnationalism and that migration may not necessarily be true for specific Puerto Rican students in the US. So all they know is the United States in particular. And that's where Lat crit comes in, because Lat crit really focuses on that legal system. So that's how I'd answer that. In terms of coloniality, I mean, we can talk all day about that, but I think for the purposes of this study, the parents had narratives of their parents going through that transnational, that circular migration, and how that impacted the home and how they understood it. In terms of language, like a lot of the students that I interviewed were not bilingual, so they lost the language, really had to fight for their ethnic identities in schools and so forth. I'm not sure that's answering your question. I had a follow-up in my brain and it didn't come out.
You're making me think that actually what you're saying is a critique about what Lat crit kind of fails.
Yeah.
Because Lat crit is large, from my understanding, is largely developed by Mexican American kind of scholars.
Exactly.
So
Thank you.
Yeah, so in some way you're making a critique of Lat crit, and you're like, this is where Lat crit is lacking, because it's so much framed in Mexican American kind of experience.
Right.
I think.
I would agree with that.
I would think. I mean, you mentioned the people that are related to Lat crit. Yeah, well,
Makes sense.
right. So I'm thinking
it's
acknowledge the Puerto Rican condition, because there is things that Puerto Ricans are dealing with that Mexican Americans don't. And so I think about immigration, for example, as a perfect example, because there's legal pieces in there.
Right.
And Mexican Americans experience those legal pieces in very different ways than Puerto Ricans.
Yeah.
Like citizenship.
Exactly.
Illegal immigrant, being called illegal immigrants and things like that. That's not, that's not quite transferable to
Right.
other
I completely
ethnicities
agree.
that can be under the umbrella. I think there you go. There's another conversation about
I remember what I was
challenging
going
what
to
that create is understood and what it's used to be.
say. Right. We see this wave in Puerto. So again, Lisa, ethnic studies. So this really comes out of Puerto Rican studies too. So that interdisciplinary understanding, like you said, Chicano studies, Black crit, very well tied together. Chicano, Puerto Rican studies, diaspora framework, very much similar. But also right now, we got pushed back on this presentation before around the anti-Blackness because I got asked if the Puerto Ricans talked about their racial experiences. And they did, but it was very anti-Black, even though some of them presented as Black themselves, right? So it's a very interesting finding that we have to explore further. And again, Afro Latinos, it's a whole other concept and understanding, but how do we integrate that within these frameworks? And the limitations are definitely there. So how race is understood on the island and then here, yeah, it's very complicated.
Yes.
The question.
I have a question. I was gonna ask, based on kind of so when you opened up your presentation and you talked about your mom and like your understanding of your positionality, and you said that your mom was racialized as Black.
Yeah.
And so I guess my question is, what did you mean by that? And like what kind of neighborhood, what was the demographic looking like in your neighborhood for them to racialize as Black?
Right. So I'll go back to her real quick. So my mom, she grew up in Salt Lake City, and within Salt Lake City, just like any other city, there's racial lines, right? Whether they're talked about or not, but they're usually train tracks of this. And then you can see, when you look at critical race spatial analysis, you understand that a little bit more. But so in Utah, there's a west side, east side divide, and at that time in the 60s, so they were the only people of color on their block. They lived a very much middle-class life in Utah, which was not heard of in terms of people of color in general. And the reference group they had at that point were Black folks, not so much, or Mexican Americans, but they were on the west side of Utah side. And so they didn't know what she was in the context of, are you Black? Are you Mexican? But you're neither. And she's a lot darker than me, so they racialized her as Black. They didn't know, I'm including the families in the neighborhood and everything like that. I think there was one other Japanese family. Actually, I know there was, my dad's best friend. So they would walk to school together, and they were the only ones in the high school together in K-12 context. So that's what I meant by Black. And that looks very different in Utah than it would here. And our understanding of Blackness, and if it was Haitian, if it was different, if it was Jamaican, it looked different. But in the context of Utah, that's what that happened at that point.
All right. Thank you so much. This was fascinating.
Thanks, Shirley. Any questions looking out?
Okay. And see you next week. Next week, actually, I'm going to talk. So
Oh, are you? What's your talk on?
I'm going to talk about some issues around the EdCPA.
Oh.